All right, I'm still trying to work my way through these slides with a little bit of a cold. This is the third presentation of Chapter 2, the Founding and the Constitution. We talked a little bit about the idea that, again, the Constitution was designed to be a lot more powerful than the Articles of Confederation, but they still wanted to curtail sort of the preemptory, the unconstrained powers, if you will, of the federal government. So when you look at the Constitution, Article 1, Sections 1 through 7 create this, the architecture of the Congress, which is the legislative branch of government. It was designed to be kind of the principal seat of government. The Constitution assigns distinctive roles to each House of Congress. The House of Representatives is supposed to originate revenue bills, for example. The Senate has the advice and consent powers, the powers to negotiate treaties, the power to confirm judicial and executive branch agencies. The character of the legislative branch was to guard against excessive democracy. Again, remember the House is supposed to be the most democratic branch. The Senate is to some extent removed from direct, kind of the direct impulses of democracy. Remember, initially, senators were selected by the Senate every 6 years. Only 1/3 of the Senate is ever up for election or up for selection. Remember, that changes with the 17th Amendment in 1913. So expansions of legislative power conferred by the Elastic Clause are, again, constrained also by the doctrine of express powers, which is to say that there have to be clear, enumerated powers that the Constitution is acting in furtherance of. The executive branch created, again, Article 2 creates a brand new office. Again, there was no executive in the Articles of Confederation. An independent executive was designed, again, to break legislative deadlocks and also to act decisively in times of emergency. And that's given rise to what a lot of critics of American government these days describe as the administrative state, the fact that government continues even in instances of stalemate. A lot of critics view that as a problem. I happen to view that as a necessary feature of modern democratic governance. Many executive powers apply to foreign affairs. There are also other traditional executive powers. When you think about foreign affairs, the president is commander-in-chief of the military. The president has extensive diplomatic authority to recognize other countries, to receive foreign ambassadors. The president has the power to appoint large numbers of people to the foreign policy bureaucracy. The traditional powers, one of the traditional executive powers is the pardoning power, which we'll probably find ourselves talking about in greater detail later on in the semester when we get to the discussion of the presidency. So the framers feared an overpowerful executive becoming what one delegate to the Constitution described as the fetus, and that's the spelling at the time, the fetus of monarchy. So they were sharply kind of constraining the powers of the executive, but over time, presidents have gotten more and more powerful. National unity and power set the new Constitution apart from the old Articles of Confederation. Articles 4, 5, and 6 are really designed to create a national government, not to create a confederacy like had previously existed, but to create a national government that had real bite and real authority. Article 4 establishes principles of reciprocity among the states. That means, first and foremost, the full faith and credit clause. The easiest way I can explain that is I earned my doctorate down in South Carolina. The fact of the full faith and credit clause means that South Carolina acknowledges the PhD I earned in another state. Right? If I got, I am married now. I was married to my wife in Oklahoma. If I were to move back to, to South Carolina, would recognize that marriage license. Likewise, there's also privileges and immunities. That's supposed to set kind of a citizenship baseline to say that you can't treat people less than the way you treat your normal citizens, okay? Article 5 establishes the process for amending the Constitution. We'll talk about that more in another slide. And then Article 6 is really important. because it basically declares the Constitution and all federal laws to be the supreme law of the land. So if the state government passes a law that is in violation of federal law, that state law yields to the federal law. We're seeing this a lot with the conflict between Texas and the federal government over Texas, stringing border wire across parts of the border between Texas and Mexico. And then finally, Article 7 establishes rules for ratifying the Constitution, which again is something that's very important. The Constitution establishes processes for amendment and ratification. Article 5 lays out, again, an arduous pathway for changing the basic rules of what is often described as the higher law, the baseline. It's very difficult to change the rules of the Constitution. Since 1789, there have been more than 11,000 amendments formally introduced in Congress. To date, there have only been 27 proposals ratified by the states in terms of formally changing the nature and character of the Constitution. And remember, the first 10 were already built in. They were all ratified en masse in 1791. All successful amendments were proposed by Congress, and all but one successful ratification took place in state legislatures. There is an alternative pathway, which I'll talk about in a second. So this kind of lays out the different pathways, okay? So if you look at it again, 2/3 of both the House and the Senate have to propose a constitutional amendment. The other way to do that would be to call a national convention. We have not done that. That hasn't ever been employed. And again, 2/3 of the states would have to agree. And then the first method for ratifying a constitution is that the majority of state legislatures in 3/4 of the states, which today is 38 states, would have to vote in favor of an amendment. And then the second pathway, which has only been done once, and that was the reversal of the 18th Amendment, is where you have state conventions called and you have elections. And again, they did that because they were getting rid of prohibition. They thought that the anti-liquor people would be well established within the state legislatures, and so they basically just moved around them. These next two slides really kind of lay out the different amendments, and again, these are good for you to memorize. Just convert them to memory. Put them on 5x7 cards. Write them out, and quiz yourself on them. That's the I don't like to just advocate for brute memorization, but there are some things that, and especially when it relates to kind of rule learning. That's kind of the best way to do it. Okay, just drill yourself on it. These are the remaining Articles of Confederation. And again, if you're thinking about, what are the most important ones since the Bill of Rights, I think the 14th and the 18th Amendments are really, really consequential. There are others that are also incredibly, kind of impactful. But when you think about the 14th Amendment, it really fundamentally changes the basic relationship between the federal government and the states, and between the federal government and citizens. It basically says that the federal government has the power to protect the equal protection of citizens. And so that, again, it's immensely impactful. Constitutional, limits on the national governments. Again, you have the separation of powers, and again, one great presidential scholar, Richard Neustadt, once said that it's sort of a misnomer to call it the separation of powers, with the fact that you have three separate institutions and you have checks and balances within them. What you really have are separate institutions sharing power. And again, this notion of balance, right? The framers were very, very interested in establishing and maintaining the idea of a balance of power among different institutions. And they understood the importance of institutions in the governing process. Federalism likewise creates an idea of kind of vertical separation of powers, where the federal government and the state governments form a compound republic and basically, again, have to negotiate in the governing process. The states have a certain amount of capability of resisting federal policies if they are viewed as somehow repugnant, to to the interests of those states. And then finally, of course, you have the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which are again protections of people's rights, and many of those again reflect the idea that we want to protect people's freedom of speech. We want them to be able to, and it's important to keep in mind, what is the Fourth through the Eighth Amendment basically deal with people that might have been accused of crimes. They wanted to be sure that there was due process of law, and so that's very important. They wanted to keep the law, the criminal law, from being used as a political cudgel against dissidents. And when we look at what happened in Russia with Alexei Navalny, that reflects this idea that we wanted to keep that from happening here in the United States. This slide is really cool for kind of showing you all the ways that the different institutions can check the other branches of government, right? And so it's just a good slide for you to review and take a look at. Obviously, the executive can veto the acts of Congress. The legislature can likewise override a veto. The president has extensive kind of override not only veto authority but appointment authorities. The judiciary has the power of judicial review over both branches of government. These are really important powers, and again, that idea is that we're going to create this network of relationships among political institutions that compel them to find common ground, compel them to find compromise. And what is hurting our politics right now is that inability to identify a common pathway to governance. That a lot of political actors feel like it's more important for them to stop governing than to identify that common pathway forward. So we got one more presentation on this chapter, and then we're going to move on to the next chapter.